welcome to another episode of The Space Between. I'm your host, Abby Holmes, and today we also have
Megan Tollefson. Hi, I'm a meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Melbourne. I'm also the Coastal Hazards and Tsunami Focal Point.
Well, Megan, it's awesome to have you. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions today about tsunamis. So, what exactly are tsunamis?
It's a great question. Tsunamis are a sudden inundation of water along our coastlines that are typically generated by a sudden displacement of the ocean floor. There's various ways of getting a tsunami, but overall, the tsunami itself is just that rush of water inland. It is not what Hollywood depicts as that giant skyscraper high singular wave. It's actually a series of waves that, start from that origin point and move outward across the ocean.
That's a really good point to make because I think we do oftentimes think of one large wave, but really is it more like storm surge?
It can be similar to storm surge. It's a good thing, something people around here would be a little bit more familiar with. The impacts are certainly very similar, but overall, the key is that it's a displacement of the ocean. That's
Right.
what makes it different from storm surge.
Right. Very cool. So, what are the potential origins of a tsunami?
So there's typically about 5 different ways that a tsunami can generate. The most common, that accounts for about 85% of tsunami generation, are earthquakes. They account for about 85% of all tsunamis. We can also have landslides, whether those are land-based, and we've got a sudden drop of a bunch of rocks, mud, anything from the land falling into the water. Or we can also have submarine landslides, which occur underwater. Another source can actually be volcanoes, which is a little bit surprising. You wouldn't think that. But in a similar fashion, if for some reason a volcano were to start erupting and one of the flanks of those volcanoes were to fall into the ocean, that can be enough to displace the ocean and generate a tsunami. One that not a lot of people would think about is actually the weather. The weather can actually cause a tsunami. They're called meteotsunamis. And when you have a really tight pressure gradient, from something like a squall line or, just a very strong front moving across the water, that pressure gradient can actually cause the ocean to displace as it moves across the ocean, and that'll generate a tsunami. And finally, in, kind of a end of the world situation or just a really bad day, meteors falling from the sky into the ocean could definitely generate a tsunami.
Wow, so that's a lot of different sources. Thank you for explaining all of those.
Of course.
So, given the fact that there's all these different origins that could happen to cause a tsunami, what are the chances of a tsunami occurring along the east coast of Florida?
So, east coast of Florida, it is a lower threshold compared to, somewhere, let's say, along the west coast of the United States. They have the Ring of Fire out there, a little bit more active earthquake-wise, but we do still have a low chance here in east central Florida. There's a few different ways that a tsunami could generate. We have a few different points where earthquakes could actually occur, the first one being the Puerto Rican Trench. We've also got the Azores-Gibraltar Fault Zone. That's another way that a tsunami could form via an earthquake. We actually have a volcano that we keep an eye on, believe it or not. It's called Cumbre Vieja. It's located in the Canary Islands. And if for some reason, while that volcano is erupting, if one of those flanks were to fail and fall into the ocean, like I mentioned earlier, that could generate a tsunami that could travel across the Atlantic Ocean. Weather can also, be a concern for here in east central Florida. If a meteor were to happen, which hopefully never.
Well, speaking of what our chances are of this occurring on the East Coast, has Florida's East Coast ever had a tsunami?
Believe it or not, yes, we actually have. Back in 1992, on July 3rd, there was actually a wave that rushed on shore in Daytona Beach. So not here, but in the Daytona Beach area. It occurred at midnight, and there were about 75 people that got injured. 100 or so cars that got damaged, and a lot of property damage as well. Initially, the first reports that came out about this specific wave described it as a rogue wave, but analysis later on down the road found that there was actually a squall line that was moving southward from the coast of the Carolinas. It moved southward across the Atlantic Ocean towards Florida, and that pressure gradient from the squall line actually generated a meteor tsunami. So yes, we have had one, and it was about 10 feet tall.
Wow. Let's see. So our next question, can you describe some of the hazards associated with tsunamis?
Absolutely. So obviously the first thing is the force of these waves is immense. And so that in and of itself is a very big concern and a big hazard when you have a tsunami. However, once that initial push of water, that sheer force, it starts picking up debris. It could be cars, it could be, random potted plants sitting outside. It'll start damaging buildings and stuff. And so you have this sheer force of water, and then you add in further debris, and it mixes up. It's moving really fast. The currents are kind of all over the place. So it's very turbulent water. It's fast-moving water. It moves faster than what the average person can run. So the water in and of itself is a concern. A lot of people think that, okay, if I'm on a boat in a dock or something, I should be fine. But that's actually not the case. If you're docked somewhere and you have a tsunami coming your way, the sudden changes and shifts in the current actually make the water very turbulent, and that in and of itself can be hazardous to boats and can flip them over, tip them over. We've seen this in other tsunamis that have occurred around the world. So just the sheer force of the water, that's dangerous. The rough currents, the flooding in and of itself is a concern, obviously. And the flooding can actually last for days, believe it or not. And you would think that, as the water starts to retreat, that things would start to get better, that conditions would improve, but that might not necessarily be the case. Sometimes the return of the water back to the ocean is just as, if not more dangerous than that initial onslaught. The best way I can describe it is, like when you're at the beach and you're just standing, kind of like letting the waves hit you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, as it's returning out, you feel that pull from the water. Right. And sometimes it's stronger. It's enough to knock people, down. So similar idea, but think of it on a much larger scale.
Wow. Okay. That's great information to know. So actually here at the city, we are hoping to become a tsunami-ready community. So we're trying to comprehend what are the complications that tsunamis bring. So we actually just underwent some inundation modeling. And so based on these inundation modeling that we have acquired, which areas of the city are at high risk for flooding and surge caused by a tsunami?
So I'll just speak generally first, and then a little bit more specific to the city itself. What we have found is that, with a tsunami coming on shore along East Central Florida's coast, and specifically towards the city, the immediate coastline is going to have the highest risk for any sort of hazards. That immediate coastline, and then, even a few blocks backwards and inland, those are areas that should be concerned. Low-lying areas, maybe places within the city that sit a little bit lower, those would also be areas that would need to, think about tsunamis.
Right.
In general, based on the inundation mapping, areas east of A1A would be the areas that would need to be most concerned. But obviously, this is going to change dependent on what the generation source is of the tsunami, how strong that source is, and where it's originating from.
Right. Thank you so much. So in the case a tsunami may hit the coast, how can I be notified?
Right, so there's a lot of different ways, and we always, at the Weather Service, we always recommend that people have multiple ways of receiving, various weather alerts across the board. Obviously NOAA weather radio, That's a great resource to get your watch warning and advisory information about tsunamis. If a tsunami warning is issued, it'll actually, send an alert to your phone. We've got those wireless emergency alerts that will broadcast to where the warning is issued, and it does activate for tsunamis. We also strongly recommend that, residents subscribe to, whatever the city, however the city disseminates their information as well, because that's a great resource in and of itself.
Awesome. Yeah, the city utilizes Everbridge, so we'll encourage everyone to sign up.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us a little bit about how coastal communities can better prepare for a tsunami?
Absolutely. Education. It's the key to everything, right? And so doing things like this, watching videos like this is the way to learn about it. Knowing what a tsunami is, knowing how to find those watches, warnings, and advisories, those are super important. It's also important to plan ahead of the time. That way you're not having to try and rush around and figure out, what do I need to do? Find out if your home in and of itself is at risk, in case of a tsunami, and do it ahead of time, not in the moment. Make a plan with, whoever you live with, your family, friends. Make sure that everyone knows, where do we go if this were to happen. Generally speaking, for here in Florida, the best place to move is inland in an event like a tsunami. And if inland is not an option, if we don't have enough, lead time on it, then the next best option is to get up higher, in a strong, sturdy building that could withstand the force of the water. But generally speaking, inland first. So, have a point designated where you want to move far enough inland that you will be safe from the effects of a tsunami.
Right. So I know I briefly mentioned it before, but the city is going to pursue a Tsunami Ready certification. So what is the Tsunami Ready program, and how can coastal communities participate in it?
And we are so excited that you guys are working on becoming Tsunami Ready. So thank you. The Tsunami Ready program is a voluntary community recognition program. It was established in 2001 between the National Weather Service and the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program. The purpose is to essentially establish a baseline across the board for all communities across the United States. How are they supposed to prepare their residents? What sort of mitigation, actions can they take in order to help prevent a tsunami from impacting their community, worse than one that isn't as prepared. It also establishes guidelines for, how to respond in the event of a tsunami. So the Tsunami Ready program in and of itself, it's a big deal, especially for coastal communities. And as of today, there are over 200 communities across the United States that are a part of this program.
Wow. That's awesome. Glad that we can be a part of it soon.
Absolutely, yes.
So, what is the most important thing you would like to stress to viewers that they can do to prepare, respond, and recover should a tsunami occur?
Like I mentioned earlier, education is going to be key. Have that plan in place before an event occurs, right? Prevention is the best way, to help plan and, help reduce, the risk that your life might be in danger. Having those multiple ways of receiving weather alerts, specifically, NOAA weather radio, the wireless emergency alerts turned on your phone, and signing up for things like Everbridge, like what the city has available to itself. And overall, just keep educating yourself about tsunamis. Know what your home's risk is. Educate your friends, things like that. That's all. That's what's going to help.
Well, awesome. I'm glad we had an opportunity today to educate our viewers on tsunamis, the risk that they pose, and what we can do to be better prepared. Thank you so much, Megan. It's been a pleasure today. And thank you so much for watching another episode of The Space Between.